Good morning, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the LA School of International Affairs, to the Institute for European Russian Eurasian Studies. I'm Peter Holberg, Director of the Institute. It's my great honor to welcome you to this workshop. It was organized in partnership with co-members of the project on political science, Middle East. And this is a joint project that's funded by the Henry Luce Foundation. It's the first conference of Central Asia, of our Central Asia program. It's a 3-year project on Islam in Russia and Russia in the Islamic world. And this program this project is led by Professor Marlene Norel. And let me just say one sentence here about Marlene's input. As director of the Institute, of course, I'm a direct observer of her work. 1 week recently, we had an event virtually every evening of that week. And this week, Marlene had also an event every day, which she was in charge of. So her energy seems to be boundless. I know it's not, but it seems like that. And I'd like you to join me in a round of applause for Professor Marlene Norel. The workshop today reminded me also that 2 years ago, our institute organized a joint conference with the Middle East Policy Forum here at GW. It was called Russia's Role in the Middle East. And Mark Katz actually was one of the speakers, so welcome. There's a little bit of continuity here. We had Max Abrams there, we had Ambassador Skip Giname as one of the speakers, and also Thomas Pickering, who gave an entire lecture, an hour and 15 minutes without looking at his paper once, and he gave this historical survey of how Russia actually engaged in the Middle East, or in what can be defined as the Middle East, starting with Catherine the Great all the way to our time. It was really, really impressive. Today's workshop, of course, is called Russia's Reshaped Role in the Middle East. Back then, 2 years ago, the discourse was more characterized by the shock that Russia was able to actually pull off what it did in Syria and the effects of it. And today, I think we're going a little more in depth also into civilizational questions of this problem. So the project overall will be studying Russia's role in the Muslim world and international Islamic organizations, as well as place and role of Muslim population, Islamic institutions, and the different Islamic political ideological trends in today's Russia, and how they align to compete with the goals of the Russian state. This topic has been under-researched very clearly in the West, and I think this is a good choice of topic in order to give the whole discourse more depth and less of a geopolitical nervousness that usually we have from the media and even in academic discourse. Marlene pointed out a paradox to me. She said that the topic falls into this academic gap between those studying Russia but not Islam, and those studying Central Asia and the Middle East but not Russia. And that was, of course, really the one of the reasons why this needs to be studied in a more synergetic manner. So I want to congratulate the organizers, particularly Marlene and Marintha Miles and Matthew Cooley, who were of great help here in bringing this together, and also congratulate you all on having gathered such an impressive group of scholars. I wish you a productive conference, and Marlene, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Peter, for your kind introduction. Thank you, everybody, for being here today. As Peter told you, so that the first workshop of a series of 6 workshops that we will have over 3 years, looking at Russia's relationship to Islam, both domestic and external Islam. And of course, we really wanted to begin the discussion by looking at what is the most kind of policy important, acute element of Russia's reshaped role in the Middle East. We decided to go over 2 panels of 4 or 5 speakers, each of them, because we thought what was really interesting would be the discussion that would be generated by the different presentation and the different perspective on what is happening on the ground. So we will begin now with the first panel on Russia's engagement strategies in the Middle East. And after our early lunch, we will be looking at Russia's military involvement in Syria and its impact. So we have a great team of scholars here from US, Sweden, France, and Russia. And I will ask them to speak for 15 minutes, so we are sure to keep 1 hour time for the discussion that I'm sure will be very lively. our first, you have the biographies of our speakers, so I will not read them, not to spend time on that, but I would like now to give the floor to our first speaker, Nikolai Gvozdiev, who is from both the Naval War College, the Foreign Policy Research Institute, and the Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs. So Nikolai, I give you the floor. We should have... Yeah, because you have some slides, I think.
That's the DoD, not come slides. Good morning, everyone. Very honored and pleased to be part of this group. I think it is a critical topic for us to look at from a variety of reasons. The impact of Russia's engagement in the Middle East on its own foreign policy vectors and directions, the impact on the region, certainly the spillover for Russia's relations with the United States and with Europe, and with South Asia as well. So there's a number of things that I think we'll be able to unpack in today's discussion. I'm here in a private capacity, so as you see from my bio, I have a number of different affiliations, including that of the U.S. Naval War College, but none of what I'm going to say today in my presentation or commentary reflects any official position or opinion, certainly of the U.S. Navy on any of these matters. When we're faced with this question of Russian strategic goals in the Middle East, it's important to keep in mind that Russia's direction in the Middle East is not separated from or distinct from Russia's overall strategic goals that it pursues in the international system. So it doesn't have a separate Middle East policy that is distinct or separated from what it is doing in Europe, what it's doing in the United States, what it does in terms of international organizations and the like. It is linked to and part of and supports Russian grand strategy. And we can boil down the key precepts of Russian grand strategy, certainly in the post-Soviet period, but actually during the Soviet and imperial periods as well, we saw these trends in play as the following 3 points. And the first, and I think the most critical, certainly for the Putin administration, is it is important to keep Russia as one of the agenda-setting powers of the world. The Russian view of the world is a starkly realist one, is a starkly zero-sum one. There are 2 types of countries in the world. You either set an agenda, or an agenda is set for you by other powers. So for Russia, you want to be on the side of the agenda setter rather than the agenda taker. This requires that you need to maintain the capabilities and status of a great power. If you wish to be an agenda setter, you have to have sufficient power, influence, and wherewithal to control agendas, to prevent agendas from being imposed on you. It requires you to have a certain amount of military capability, economic capability, soft power, political influence, and the like. So that Russian involvement in the Middle East flows directly from this precept. If Middle East is one of the areas where Russia can show that it is an agenda setter, that it sets agendas rather than takes them, that it has the ability to influence others, that it has the ability to insert itself into matters beyond its borders and to be taken seriously as an intermediary, as a mediator, as an interlocutor. The second element of Russian grand strategy that fits into this is that Russia needs to have the ability to project power and influence over this extended Eurasian or greater Eurasian space. If we think of kind of the Eurasian core, and then we think of East Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, the greater Middle East, and then Europe as abutting that greater Eurasian space. The ability of Russia to be a credible player, a diplomatic player, a military player, an economic player, requires that you have tools of statecraft. Requires that others see that your ability to wield those tools of statecraft is in their interests as well. And that comes to the third point, and this certainly has been, certainly since Ivan IV, a key driver of Russian foreign policy, and that was kept in Peter the Great and in Soviet times and in post-Soviet times. that it is imperative for Russia to obtain the resources that it needs, technological, financial, skills, for economic development and for modernization, because you can't have number two if you don't have number three. And if you don't have number two, you can't have number one. So all of these are interplayed as part of Russia's strategy. And again, in the Middle East, is this a place where Russia can project influence? By projecting influence, does that do things such as make Russian weaponry much more attractive, since you have the demonstration effect, and certainly the second panel may touch on this a bit more. The direct linkage between the Russian intervention in Syria in 2015 and increases in Russia's ability to sell weapons around the world, since they can demonstrate what they can do, what their systems can do. Or having countries of the region in the Middle East invested in wanting Russia to be able to play this role. So whether that means signing deals for billions of dollars of investment to be directed into Russia, or for Russia to gain access to economic concessions and the like, all of that will then feed into this approach. I could stop here and say, well, we've solved the question, right? Now we know what Russian grand strategy is, and therefore we can understand Middle East policy. But then that backs us, of course, into decision-making. How does the Russian system take strategic concepts and operationalize them in terms of policies? And this is where we get to the question of vectors and sectors. This is a concept that myself and Chris Marsh, about 5 years ago, in our study of Russian foreign policy, we wanted to move away from the master plan narratives that there's a master plan in the Kremlin that dictates everything that happens, and it's slavish adherence to this plan that is how you can understand Russian foreign policy. So instead, we looked at, well, how are these strategic goals interpreted by different actors within the Russian system? How do they operationalize them? How do they define their priorities? And of course, there is no such thing as a single unified Russian foreign policy. There are different factions, there are different groups, there's clans and political rivalries in the Kremlin. There are rivalries between different key political and economic leaders. You bring in regional leaders into this as well, who may want to play in the foreign policy field. You bring in the corporations, you bring in public interest groups and the like. And you see that there's a variety of different perspectives on what Russia should be doing in the world, where it should be investing its time and resources, who Russia's friends are, who Russia's enemies are, who preferred partners are, and the like. And in the Russian system, what we have is policy contradictions exist, and the importance of the role of the presidency in trying either to unify policy or to dictate an outcome and impose that outcome on others, or what we've generally seen in the last number of years in Russian foreign policy is brokering satisficing compromises. That is, Russian policy often ends up being a series of compromises between different groups, different perspectives, in an attempt to try to give everyone a half a loaf or a quarter of a loaf for what they want. Our point here was when a vector joins with a sector, so an economic sector of the economy or a particular group within the government, you see the emergence of a foreign policy. And so when it comes to the Middle East, these are our principal vectors and sectors. It's not an exhaustive list. There's certainly many more that we could add. But we see Russia's policy in the Middle East, a variety of different vectors. There are those who say, well, Russia's involved in the Middle East primarily because this is a way to influence the American vector. The Middle East itself doesn't really matter. It's intervening in the Middle East because this has an impact and influence on Russia's relationship with the United States, either to compel the United States to do something, raise costs for the United States, and if the United States gives us what we want, we're not interested in the Middle East. So you have those people that say the Middle East is very instrumental. Those that say the Middle East is adjunct to Russia's long-term relationship with Europe. Again, Russia should be involved in a place like Libya, not because Libya matters, but because this is a way for Russia to have influence in Southern Europe, particularly in Italy, or Russia's role in stemming or releasing migrant flows from the Middle East into Europe as a way to influence European policy towards Russia. And then, of course, you have different vectors within the Russian establishment. The emergence of Turkey as a strategic partner. Should it be Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states? The role of Iran. Is Iran Russia's main partner or not? And then how that plays out with Syria. Israel. We now have the Vienna meeting occurring today between Russia and the other OPEC plus countries in OPEC. Is this the principal vector by which Russia should be thinking of the Middle East? Other states, is it time to restore earlier Soviet-era ties with Egypt, to restore them in a post-Soviet period, the Russian involvement in Libya? Is the vector the greater Black Sea and Caspian region, and Russia's relations with other countries in the region should be subordinated to its ultimate goals in the Black Sea and Caspian basins? And then different sectors. Within the government, the foreign ministry, the defense ministry, the presidential administration, the intelligence communities all have differing perspectives, both within each of these groups and then among them. The energy companies, Rosneft, Gazpromneft, Novatek, Zarubezhneft, and others, the atomic energy companies that seek new contracts and businesses, the energy services industry, space industry, military-industrial complex, mining and resource companies, the agricultural sector, given the extreme importance of Russian foodstuffs for feeding people in the Middle East. People in the Middle East eat or don't eat to some extent based upon food coming from Russia, and to the extent that the 2010 drought in Russia is a precipitating cause of the Tahrir Square uprising in Egypt at the end of 2010, when after Russia stopped its grain exports and Egyptians saw their food prices quadruple. And does this lead to unrest? Or is, and again, with the Russian relationship with Saudi Arabia, unstated part, mostly we focus on the OPEC side of it, but the food side of it is also important. The investment sector, particularly RDIF under Kirill Dmitriev, and of course he was in Saudi Arabia this past month for the Saudi Arabia's Futures Conference and signing some important deals there. The role of the Orthodox Church, which has always had an interest in the Middle East. This goes back hundreds of years. There would not be an Arab patriarchate in Antioch, in Damascus, if it wasn't for the role that the Russian Church played in 1899, for instance, plus all of the ties that were created in that among religious communities. The Islamic community in Russia plays a big role in mediating the interests of the Russian state in the Middle East, both in the religious sense, but also among co-ethnics that live in Russia with others who live in the Middle East, so Chechens, Circassians, and others. The role of the regional governments, and here Russia has an advantage that other powers do not, which is I think there are, as of yet, still 0 American governors who can make the Hajj to Mecca. There are plenty of regional Russian leaders, presidents of Tatarstan and Chechnya and others, who, in fulfilling their religious obligation to make the Hajj, can also then be meeting with people in Saudi Arabia and doing stopovers elsewhere in the Middle East, which is an important connecting point. And again, we see sometimes the role of the regional governors as and elites as driving Russian policy in the region. So all of this means there's a lot of things on the table. I'm not going to be the one to then walk you through it. It's what the rest of my co-panelists will do today. They'll start unpacking a bit more of where some of these vectors and sectors are coming together. But to leave you with a nice complicated map, which again gives you a sense though that Russia, this is not the Soviet period in that we don't really have Team Red and Team Blue in the Middle East anymore. This isn't a point where we had in the Cold War where you had to declare you were on one side or the other, and where the Soviet Union wanted you in the camp of socialist and nationalist progressive regimes against Western-backed governments. Russia today, in its outreach to Turkey, does not demand that Turkey leave NATO. In its outreach to Israel, makes no demands on Israel ending its special relationship with the United States. does not request of Qatar that it close American military bases in order to have cooperation, and that Russia also is seeking ways to insert itself as friendly to everyone, enemy to no one. We, the Russians, can be a broker. We can help craft deals. We can create balances. So, between Turkey and Kurds in Iraq, Turkey and Kurds in Syria, trying to work out rules of engagement between Israel and Iran with regard to Syria, to try to intervene in keeping ties open. And again, the point of all of this is to, in my assessment, and my panelists may or may not agree with this, in either in this session or in the second one, my sense is that the Russians are trying to make themselves indispensable in the region, and by making themselves indispensable, not for long-term solutions, but to essentially say we have the capabilities to try to jury-rig solutions that can hold the region together. We can talk to Iranians, we can talk to Israelis, we can talk to Turks, we can talk to Kurds, we talk to the Syrians, we talk to the Saudis, we talk to the Gulf states, the Egyptians, the Libyans, and others. We can try to bring a modicum of stability to the region, and in return for this, we want the countries of the region to be invested in Russia's position both as a great power, in helping to maintain it, and in doing things that will help Russia in its other goals, for example, evading Western sanctions. So if Western banks don't want to finance things in Russia because of sanctions, well, would it be nice if Saudi and Gulf money comes in? And maybe having technology transfer that's banned from the EU countries because of sanctions, but maybe Saudi and Israeli firms will be interested in helping bring goods and services into the Russian economy. So it's not simply a matter of altruism or Russia pursuing great power status for the sake of great power status, but also because they believe there are concrete benefits that the Russian state will gain from its involvement. And then finding ways, of course, to limit the costs of Russian involvement so that they do not fall into what they see as the strategic trap the U.S. falls into, which is the U.S. gets involved, the U.S. invests a lot, and then can't extricate itself as easily from the region. The Russian investment so far in what they have done in the Middle East has been modest, certainly by U.S. standards, but the payoff for Russia has been much greater. I think that's the model they're trying to work with. So with that, I think this was to try to set the tone for at least some of our discussions for today. So I will stop here and allow Ekaterina to pick up the discussion.
Thank you so much, Nicola, for indeed showing us the kind of big picture. I would like now to give the floor to Ekaterina Stepanova from the National Research Institute of World Economy and International Relations in Moscow, known as IMEMO, of course, and from also the Russian Academy of Science.
Thanks, Mara. Actually, it could be relevant to say that the new name is Prima for national relations in this particular setting. I want to thank Nicholas for actually indeed setting very well the agenda, and some of the issues you kind of start to raise, I'll pick up. But I want to talk about two things because we are short on time. So I'll devote my presentation to just two themes. One is what I see as the main trend, underlying, really fundamental trend, a relatively recent one, in Russia's policy towards the Middle East, which is regionalization of this policy. And second, I will go in some detail and talk about benefits and, if you like, downsides, problems with this limitations of this regionalization. What I'm not going to talk about is probably the most interesting part, the implications for the West, but we can do it afterwards. We have plenty of time. Now, on regionalization, I mean, everyone probably agrees among the speakers today that upgrade of Russia's role in Syria, primarily a result of the start of its military campaign since 2015, has brought Russia back to the Middle East. So very few observers doubt now that Russia is there to stay. Even as for Russia, that does not being a staying power does not imply a return to any grand Cold War style hegemonistic revisionist plans. But military capacity that was demonstrated by Russia in Syria was not matched at all at the time by its overall leverage in the region, let alone, I'm not even mentioning its very limited economic role. So Russia showed a larger military capacity in Syria than merited by everything else, by its resources and the region policy, and so on. For me, military engagement alone since 2015 cannot explain, it's not a sufficient explanation for increase in Russia's influence and engagement across the region. It certainly played a role, it catalyzed this growing influence, but it's not the sole explanation. I argue that another and more underlying explanation is due to Russia's ability to grasp, that it developed, it took time to develop, ability to grasp, accept, and adjust to this key trend endemic to the region, relatively recent trend. So regionalization of basically everything. Regionalization of politics and security in the Middle East, implying growing role of regional powers, factors, dynamics that on many issues outmatch even or compete effectively with extra-regional players. And I would argue that Russia fares at this adjustment, accepting this reality, quite better than the West does. This is one of the very few comparative strategic advantages that Russia has by now in the Middle East. I would even go as far as to say that I think the West's real problem in the region is not with Russia. It's with this difficulty to accept and adjust to regionalization of politics and security in the Middle East. Now, as I said, this regionalization of Russia's Middle East policy took, and by the way, it happened not just in the Middle East. We can talk for Afghanistan, it would be the same thing, the regionalization of Russia's policy in Afghanistan. But it took at least a decade and a half. It didn't happen overnight, after Syria, after the intervention into Syria. It took a long time to evolve. It was a very incremental and gradual process that involved reaching out to multiple regional partners, while trying to distance itself from intra-regional strifes. Officially, it's called multi-vector policy. Also involves pragmatism, very high degree of cultural relativism, and selective opportunism. But it was later, which is particularly pertinent, I think, to the topic of your larger project. All these small things were reinforced by a qualitative shift, a very important one. Roughly since mid-late of the last decade, which is a shift from very harsh and indiscriminate anti-Islamist stance to what I would call a broad acceptance by Russia of political Islam in and out of the governments across the Middle East, and even so general acceptance of reformist, legalist, non-violentist Islamism, but even reaching out at times, to select violent Islamists and opposition actors, if, for instance, merited by the needs of conflict resolution and so on. So against this background, this slowly evolving, balanced kind of approach, Russia's side-picking in Syria, basically, especially early on, just one-sided support to Assad regime, that culminated in direct military intervention on its behalf. In theory, this ran against this trend of, you know, diversification, balancing, and so on, and could have damaged seriously or undermined this trend, you know, of regionalization, this balancing act, you know, that Russia was playing. But as we see now, it didn't. We can discuss why, because I think Syria was an outlier for a number of reasons for Russia, but it did not, and in fact, the main difference between Russia's regional act, if you like, regional balancing act, pre-Syria and after Syria, post-Syria, is that now it just does the same thing but with many more partners, regional partners. And it does so, continues to do so, but from the standpoint of a more influential player in the Middle East. Because before the upgrade of its policy in Syria, it was a relatively marginal player in the region. Now, just to finish with the Syria as a threshold or whatever, the main, and I'm sorry if I'm repeating something that we've been discussing even in this room for quite some time, but the main drivers for Russia's military intervention in Syria had very little to do with the region itself. So Syria was largely instrumentalized. The decision to intervene, you know, to upgrade engagement to military, direct military involvement, was largely instrumentalized at the time, which was what three years ago, for broader foreign policy purposes. The two main ones as a trump card in Russia's very troubled, deteriorating relations with the West, post-Ukraine and so on. But second, also as a showcase of, at a more ideological level, if you like, as a showcase of prevention of regime change by force, especially the potential Western intervention, post-Libya context and so on. There was certainly some degree of genuine global anti-terrorist concern, yeah? But these were the two main drivers. At that time, ironically, this idea of expanding Russia's regional influence was not the primary driver. It was an extra. Okay, the main goals were beyond Syria or the Middle East. You know, goals related to the Middle East, that was an extra, kind of a bonus if everything else works out. And this is how it happened. So basically, Russia's engagement in Syria did catalyze a follow-up upgrade and overall standing in the region, which in turn stimulated Moscow to start actually paying more attention to the Middle East per se, to start to develop an independent interest in the Middle East per se. So today, as of now, I would say regionalization, it continues, Russia's policy, and it follows three main tracks. One is basically new forms and areas, you know, of Russia's regional influence. The second track is, I think, perhaps the most important one, and I think Nicholas partly referred to that. There's been a qualitative shift from more Western-centric approach to the Middle East, which dominated much of post-Cold War Russia's policy in the region, to a more region-centered approach. This is a very important shift, and I would even argue that strategically it's probably more important, far more important than like mere diversification of partnerships, you know, because it's, and I'm not sure there's a way back, frankly. And then finally identifying and more actively pursuing its own economic, political, security interests in the Middle East, which can only be done, which requires a certain weight in the region, something that Russia did not have before Syria, but which something that it has now. Now, very quickly, going through benefits and inherent limitations, and I'll try to illustrate that by looking at current, you know, developments, more updated situation in and beyond Syria. Now, in terms of benefits, in the Syrian context and in the broader regional context. In the Syrian context, by the way, of course, the Astana format, you know, this regionally, Russia plus regional powers, Turkey and Iran brokered ceasefire format, is of course a direct product of regionalization. So, a manifestation, very evident manifestation of regionalization. Now, in terms of benefits, well, intransigent as Russia may be seen by the West in dealing with the West, in Russian-West relations. In the Middle East context, Russia has been very quickly learning the art of compromise and flexibility with regional partners, and specifically on Syria with such uneasy partners as Turkey, Israel, and Iran and Israel. All three of them are like main partners. Second, this approach appeared to be quite resilient to system shocks, of which we had plenty. You know, that tainted all sorts of incidents and risks and difficult situations that tainted bilateral relations between Russia and regional powers on Syria, in the Syrian context. So suffice to mention these 2 plane shootdowns by Turkey 3 years ago, and well, Israel's role in Syrian shootdown of a Russian plane just back in September. But again, if to quote from Erdogan, I think he said it last month at the celebration of the completion of the offshore part of the Turk Stream pipeline. So speaking about Russian-Turkish relations, he said, our relations have already been through all kinds of possible tests. I think this applies very well also to Moscow's relations over Syria with Tehran and with Tel Aviv. Or I don't know, in the US, Jerusalem, whatever is the current. Astana, I mean, I think there's a general agreement on that. It has not led to yet, at least to activation of Geneva format and full. But it did a lot of other things, and among these things, I would say it stimulated diplomatic activity on the side of the West. So if only for that, it has been a useful format. I'd say that this, the so-called small group, US-led format involving key European partners, plus Saudis, plus Egypt, plus Jordan. The latter 2 are also very good partners with Russia on Syria. But this small group, very recent format, I see it as a belated reaction to Astana by the West, which is, although it's often seen as a competing format, alternative, whatever, but I'd say it's not a bad sign, because at least it shows that on the side of the US administration, we see a bit more interest in the region, first and foremost, and then in diplomacy. In diplomatic ways and means. It's not, of course, Gary level yet, but still we have professionals finally assigned to proper positions. There are people to talk to meaningfully, finally, and so on. Now, what distinguishes Astana? So better late than never in terms of small group, wouldn't harm. What distinguishes Astana as a product of regionalization? The relevance of this particular format is no longer, it's just beyond the US control. The emergence, the functioning, and whether or not it will continue, it's just not a matter for the US to decide at all anymore. No matter what, with all due respect, Ambassador Jeffrey, Special Envoy on Syria, who just recently said, let's. I mean, if this deadline for Constitutional Committee is not met by the end of this year, we'll pull the plug on Astana. With all due respect, it's just, I mean, it's not his business anymore, frankly. So even in the absence of the progress on, Astana Plus, Constitutional Committee, and we'll see, current outgoing Special Envoy, U.S. Special Envoy Damistura is to report on that as far as well addressed to the UN Security Council, whether or not some progress has been achieved. But Astana will persist for quite some time, if only to ensure and improve coordination between parties involved on the ground and beyond, to complete the de-escalation zone experiment. It's a very interesting format. It's very different from Safe Haven or anything like this. organized. It's not primarily humanitarian format. The next meeting is already scheduled for February, next February, of Astana format. There'll be an expanded range of observers to now include also, well, Jordan is already there, but Lebanon, possibly Iraq, possibly the Emirates. Now, just very briefly, benefits of regionalization in the broader Middle East context. I'll try to sum up, kind of to give you the picture. Well, as a result of this, what does it give? You know, today, for instance, we're in a strange situation that of all great powers, it's Russia that appears to have best relations with Turkey. Strangely enough, but that's how it is, despite support to opposite sides in the Syrian civil war. This is the benefit of regionalizing your policy. To the point of, I don't want to go into detail, but to the point of the latest Idlib agreement, you know, when basically Russia used its whatever power it could gather to prevent Damascus from starting a major military offensive, all to accommodate Turkish interests. You know, massive flow of refugees potentially across the border and so on. I'll have to. Russia steadily continues with Mission Impossible, which is keeping good relations with both Israel and Iran, and is firmly set to keep on with this. These are two constants of Russia's policy. It has much upgraded its relations with most Gulf states. Has some of the best relationships ever with Egypt, even compared to Soviet times by some counts, under Al-Sisi. Russia is not a lead mediator on either Libya or Yemen, but is in high demand, by the way, from local parties, you know, to play some mediating role, and has carved a diplomatic niche for itself in both cases. And you know, it's modestly active again on Israeli-Palestinian settlement, and so on and so forth. Do I have 2 words on limitations? Because otherwise it sounds that there are no problems. I mean, there are problems.
1 minute.
Okay. Main limitations. I leave the economic reconstruction side, you know, aside, because we have, I think Ivan or someone is making a separate presentation on the issue in the next panel. On the political security side, regionalization can produce Astana. Regionalization cannot produce Geneva. Regionalization cannot produce a UN-level, internationally, fully internationally recognized political solution. Period. You know, so when people even come up from Damistura to the US officials, and they come up and say, you know, the latest round of Astana talks, it's failed because there's no political problem. My question would be, is it a failure, missed opportunity, or is it just the wrong format? You know, there are inherent limits to what Astana can achieve in principle. It's just a swell measure, but select regional powers coming together and trying to sort of. It was never meant to address substantive issues of political future of Syria. It was a more technical format, you know, to ensure that ceasefire, improve security on the ground, you know, ensure that the lasting ceasefire is in place, and so on and so forth. I have to stop here, but there are other downsides, which Russia, my final sentence. The reason Russia can live up with these downsides, with these problems, is that the way it sees it approaches them, is not so much as unsurmountable sort of obstacles, but more as the rules of the game. Okay, the rules of the game that stem a natural progression of many different conflicting regional interests. Okay, I'll have to stop.
We have time to come back on that during the discussion. Thank you, Katja. Let's continue our analysis with Mark Katz from George Mason University.
Great. Thank you very, very much. And following 2 great presentations, it's not so easy, partly because they've said a lot of what I intended to say. Although their perspectives are different, a lot of what they say actually agree with each other. I also just want to thank Marlene for this invitation. You know, I think following Marlene's career over the years, It really is amazing. Although I've said this often, I've never said it to her, I really believe that she is the Adam Ulam of our generation. So that depends on whether you like Adam Ulam or not. But her accomplishments are truly remarkable. So it's an honor to be invited by her for this. In any event, I think that following on from the two previous speakers, certainly the Russian diplomatic achievement in the Middle East at present, in many ways, it is a greater one than during the Soviet era. During the Soviet era, the Middle East was divided. That the Soviets had their allies, the U.S. had a separate set of allies. Sometimes those allies switched. Pro-American ones became with change of regimes, became pro-Soviet ones. Sometimes it worked the other way around, as with Egypt and Saudi Arabia, Egypt and Somalia. But there were only a few that seemed to maintain good ties with both. Kuwait was one, North Yemen, and then of course there was one that had good ties with neither, and that was revolutionary Iran. Then of course we saw Russia retreat, not fully, from the Middle East in the 1990s, and then with Putin, really from the time he first came to power, rebuilding of Russian influence. And as the previous speakers indicated, this time around, although the U.S. tends to have its set of allies and its set of adversaries in the Middle East, that the hallmark of Russian diplomacy is that they get along with everyone. They get along with Iran, they get along with Israel, they get along with Saudi Arabia, the GCC, whatever that is anymore. They get along with the UAE, they get along with Qatar, and in the various conflicts, certainly with regard to Libya, as we've seen, they work with the transitional government. They work with General Haftar. In Yemen, they recognize the Saudi-backed government, but they also talk with the Houthis. And certainly, I've attended the last two Valdai conferences on the Middle East. That's not the big Valdai with Putin, that's the little one with Lavrov. What's amazing is that southern Yemenis are there. In other words, that they've kept this possibility, shall we say, going as well. And certainly, with regard to Syria, and obviously Russia supports one side in particular, but they talk to the other sides as well. And so, this sort of balancing act is quite remarkable. And certainly, the image that we have is that the U.S. policy in the Middle East is not so clever, successful, but that the Russians seem to do very well. And so the implication is that in that they've done so well up to now, that they're probably going to do even better. Now, Katerina didn't get that time to talk about the limitations, so perhaps I can dwell a little bit on that. And I think that certainly, many Russian scholars recognize that probably one of the biggest mistakes of Soviet foreign policy was to break ties with Israel in 1967. That what that meant was that when the Arabs were finally willing to talk with Israel, Russia was not in a position to help them, whereas the U.S. was. And of course, what we saw was an American-led conflict resolution effort, starting with Camp David. In other words, you almost never hear anything good about President Carter's administration. But this is one achievement, the Camp David Accords, that not only did it occur, but over 40 years later, we still have it going. And it is pretty amazing. And I think that many Russians now see Moscow in the same position now that the U.S. was in then. In other words, that Russia can talk to all sides, whereas the U.S. cannot or will not do so. Therefore, Russia is in a better position to help states resolve their various differences. But I think, though, that is a possibility. That is definitely a possibility. The trouble, of course, is that conflict resolution, although the ability to talk to all sides is a necessary condition for bringing it about, it's not a sufficient one. And I think that here we've seen one of the things that certainly helped the U.S. in terms of bringing about the Camp David Accord, was that the U.S. was willing and able to pay both Israel and Egypt an awful lot of money. Now, they had to want to make peace to begin with, so it wouldn't have worked otherwise, but we have been paying for all these years. And it's not clear to me that Russia is able or willing to play a similar role. Certainly, at these Waldai conferences, sort of one of the themes was that the reconstruction of Syria as pacification was a global public good, and therefore the globe should contribute to it. In other words, that Russia can't be expected to do this on its own. And I guess sort of, the reaction, of course, among the Gulf Arabs and the West was not quite so enthusiastic, shall we say. But the thing is that this is a different model of being a great power. Because for the U.S., the model of being a great power was for conflict resolution. We essentially subsidize it. This doesn't seem to be in the Russian way of thinking about being a great power in the Middle East. And I have a feeling, though, that it's going to take something like this, that these people are going to have to be paid to make peace if that can happen. And of course, some of these actors are so very, very wealthy that it's not, this is not, but they have to want to do this. Now, we talked about how Russia can talk to all sides, and certainly all sides are talking to Russia. You see, Netanyahu, and how many trips to Russia has he made? I thought it was more like 11. I mean, not just Moscow, but Sochi and whatever. It is quite. Sorry. But now, since then, he's been going. He's been going as well. He's been going an awful lot. We saw King Salman, the first visit from a Saudi monarch to Moscow. This really was a major development that took place. We see the Iranians meeting with Putin. We see Turks. So we can just go on and on. The Egyptians, etc. Qatar in particular. And it seems it's almost as if like your adversary goes to Moscow, we damn well better go there as well, and at least be seen as doing it. But the thing is that in terms of talking about Russia's policy in the Middle East, or really any outside actor's policy for the Middle East, what we also do need to think about is what are the motives of the actors in the region. And the thing is that do Middle Eastern actors, do they value Russia because they see it as helping them to resolve conflict, or is it that they see Russia helping their adversary? They want to mitigate to the extent to which it does, and therefore that the Middle East has very much learned, as they have done with the West for a long time, how to play the Russians. So there's how to provide certain incentives so that Moscow and that individual Russian leaders take their interests into account. And I think because what it amounts to is that for the Saudis in particular, they've tried for years. In other words, that their approach has been, we will buy weapons from Russia, etc. Cut back on your relations with Iran. Putin's made it clear that he doesn't want to do that. And so I think the Saudis have learned is that okay, we'll play this game. We will talk about deals with Russia, etc. We'll talk about buying the S-400. And by the way, we all know that Russia's only sold the S-300 to Iran. Now, whether the Saudis actually end up buying it or not, I'm sure part of their incentive is that it creates a lot of discomfort in Tehran for the Saudis to be seen talking about buying these S-400s, and that's something valuable in and of itself. So the local actors, it's not necessarily that they're looking to Russia for conflict resolution. What they want is to somehow bring Russia closer to their side. Now, what I think has been remarkable about Russian foreign policy is that they have played this game, and they have played it very, very well. And as the Procurator pointed out, they have the best relations with Turkey. It's better than the West, than the U.S., better than the Europeans. But as we know, it doesn't always go so well between Russia and Turkey. In other words, it can go sour and go sour very quickly, as did. I'm not saying it will again, but that there is this potential. I also think that, what we've seen with regard to, the balancing between Israel and Iran in Syria is that we have sort of anecdotal evidence that from Israeli sources, also from Saudi sources, that what the Russians say to them is that you don't like Iran being in Syria, well, isn't it a good thing that we're there too? Because obviously, if we're there, we can control them. If we're not there, you face them there on your own. Do you want that? And the answer is no, thank you. But what we've seen though is that with this incident with Israel, and I thought it was quite interesting how Dr. Wiener phrased it about sort of the Israeli role in the shoot down of this plane, because after all, it was shot down by the Syrian government, by Russia's ally, and I wondered at sort of the press coverage of this, because in my view is that is there a possibility that the Syrians, if not did this deliberately, but certainly took advantage of the fact that Israeli aircraft were in the region? In other words, who has benefited from this action? I was at a presentation recently in terms of talking about even sort of the level of technology that the Syrians have for their S-200s with the radars, that there is no way in hell that you could mistake an Israeli fighter for this Russian aircraft. That whoever fired that missile could have told the difference. Doesn't mean it's deliberate. It could have been mistaken, but that, it was Syria that was at fault here. And I think that what we've seen is that, has Russia been able to assuage? Now what we've seen is that, Netanyahu has, it's just remarkable in terms of how he deals with the Americans. He sort of abased himself in front of Putin. And like, oh, this is terrible, we can't do this, and the Russians are not, are being very cold and distant. Because what we do seem to understand is what the Israeli press has suggested is that Israeli strikes on Syrian targets have continued. And they're very likely to continue. And I don't think the possession of S-300s by the Syrian armed forces is going to stop them. And so we're at a point where just how much of the balancing act can Russia perform? Because the Iranians don't seem to be wanting to stop their activities. The Israelis aren't going to stop either. In other words, that this willingness to work with Russia kind of depends on Russia's ability to come through. And if the various sides don't see it, I think the Katerina is right. In other words, what we really do see in the Middle East is the regionalization. What matters far less is either America's policy, Russia's policy. What matters more is Iran's policy, Saudi policy, Israeli policy, and that these countries, they defy the U.S. They'll defy Russia as well. That's just sort of the nature of this part of the world, it seems to me. So, one of the things I think that is a problem. In other words, I think that Russia does have an interest in conflict resolution, because one of the problems is that if any of the existing conflicts really do get out of hand, it could force a very difficult. How many we got? Oh, just two. That's all those nice things I said about you. If it's more of a conflict, and I think that if there's an Israeli-Iranian conflict, I think that the choices for Russia are difficult. If America supports Israel, as it's very likely to do, does Russia then support Iran in response? Well, what does that do for its influence, not just with Israel, but with the Arab world? Does Russia commit on the side of Israel along with the U.S.? Well, what does it do for its position in Iran? Does Russia do nothing and return to the situation where America has a greater role? So, it's if this remarkable balancing act of sort of keeping all sides in balance, as long as the pot doesn't boil over, that's fine. But the trouble is that the initiative for whether the people who have their hand on the gas are in that region and not necessarily in Russia. So that's, I think, part of the problem that Russia faces. And I guess I'm just more obedient. So I guess I'll stop here.
Thank you so much. And I would like to give the floor to Anna Borchevskaya from the Washington Institute for Near East Policy.
Great, thank you very much. Looking down at my notes after these excellent presentations, I think mine is going to be a lot shorter because there's so much overlap with what was said. But the good news is that I will try to speak for less than 15 minutes so as not to repeat too much from what was said earlier. So I'm going to start by saying that the Kremlin is primarily concerned with regime survival. And this the way it views its regime survival is intrinsically connected with its relationship with the West as it searches for great power status in its source of domestic legitimacy. And I think that's the overarching larger goal. And Nicholas, in his presentation, referred to Russia's larger strategic interest, the zero-sum view of politics. I think this is very important to keep in mind when we look at Russia's activities in the Middle East and elsewhere. Putin certainly had multiple goals in the Middle East, but fundamentally, the Syria intervention was more about the US-led global order. And there were many other benefits and interests, but fundamentally, it was about this multipolar world that Russian officials have been talking about for years. And certainly that pertains to Russian activities elsewhere in the region as well. My second point is that Russia has a lot of staying power in the region. It's been able to wield a lot of influence. Whether or not that will stay, certainly there are a lot of questions, but at least in the near to medium term, Russia has a lot of staying power. Moscow's quest for control in this region has centuries deep roots, as was alluded to earlier. Geopolitical, domestic, cultural, and religious. Russia's brief retreat from the region in the 1990s under Yeltsin was more of an exception than the rule. And certainly when Putin came to power after he succeeded Yeltsin, he worked from the very beginning to bring Russia back to the region. And this vision of a multipolar world, it echoes Yevgeny Primakov, who also talked about a multipolar world order. Certainly that's the view that Putin has applied to the region. So Putin has worked very consistently. He's actually a fairly consistent person, I would argue, from the beginning to bring Russia to the region by building connections with everybody through diplomatic exchanges, through arms sales, through provision of high technology goods such as nuclear reactors and so forth. But it was really the Syria intervention, of course, that publicly brought Russia back on the Middle East map. As so many, all of my previous speakers have said, Russia has been unencumbered by ideology, and this has proven to be a more successful approach than that of the Soviet Union, this ability to talk to everybody in the region, and Putin has maintained an incredible balancing act to this day in the region, even though I would say he still tilted more towards the anti-American Shia forces in the region, but even so, this was a balancing act. The U.S. now has to contend with Russia to the degree it hasn't had to for decades, politically, diplomatically, and militarily. Certainly one reason for this is what's called the anti-access aerial denial, the A2AD layout that Russia has managed to build with its Syria intervention. Mostly in the air, but also increasingly in the water. It's interesting, we are seeing now Russia seeking port access beyond Syria. And Libya is certainly another useful country in that regard. Moscow's recent transfer of the S-300 that was discussed earlier to the Syrian Arab Army, a very controversial one, fits within this A2AD layout. And a lot of questions, I think we're still in the middle of this story about how this is all going to play out, but certainly it was mainly a political message. Israel indeed has been able to continue strikes in Israel, but the fact of the matter is this was a statement of dominance. Russia asserting its dominance in the region. Now, the A2AD layout has succeeded partially. It hasn't been a full A2AD layout means that nobody else can operate in this bubble. That's not the case. The United States continues to operate, but the fact of the matter is Russia has complicated these operations. And U.S. allies have been hedging their bets, and this is another reason for Moscow's success. The U.S. has been inconsistent, frankly, hasn't really had a clear strategy in the region of their policy for years. But and so they've come to see Moscow as a more consistent, a more reliable interlocutor, somebody who sticks by his friends, for better or worse, whereas America remains wavering. Assad remains in power, confident of Moscow and Tehran's support, and I should say on his own, he's actually pretty weak militarily. He talks a lot about retaking every inch of the Syrian territory, but he doesn't have the resources to do that on his own. And frankly, it's one thing to take the territory, it's quite another to hold the territory. What that says is he continues to feel confident of Moscow's support. And you know, the benefits for Russia were myriad, but one thing I wanted to mention that hasn't come up is the humanitarian catastrophe that Russia's support of Assad helped to perpetuate. Not just through the flow of refugees into Europe, but through Assad's, frankly, genocidal policies towards his own population. Moscow's partnership with Iran, of course, shows no signs of abating. I'm going to try to not go into too many details, again, about American allies in the region, but it's certainly worth noting, again, that Egypt is turning increasingly closer to Moscow. It's through arms, through nuclear energy. Egypt used to be an American partner in nuclear energy, but that's not the case anymore. Russian tourists make a significant contribution to the Egyptian economy. I frankly wouldn't even discount the possibility of Russia flipping Egypt entirely. Turkey, certainly we've seen edge closer to Moscow, though it's a different relationship, I would say, than with Egypt, and this was also discussed in the previous presentations. The very fact that the discussion is taking place between Russia and Egypt of the S-400 alone shows you how much influence Russia has been able to achieve. Such a discussion alone, whether it leads to an actual transfer or not, illustrates, this conversation would have been unthinkable a decade ago. A lot of this has to do with Erdogan's own anti-Westernism, but also because of fear of Kurdish nationalism, which is, of course, ironic given Moscow's long-standing, centuries-long ties to the Kurds. But it's also illustrative of how many regional states give Russia a free pass. Russian tourists is also another big element of the Turkish economy, Egyptian and Turkish. The Saudi Arabian King Salman's historic visit to Moscow that Mark has mentioned. Even Morocco has grown closer to Russia in recent years in terms of Russian support for Morocco's nuclear energy. And Algeria has actually never left Moscow's camp to begin with. Moscow has made relatively few inroads in Iraq since Nouri al-Maliki's premiership, but it had more success with the KRG, with the Kurdistan Regional Government. We saw Rosneft last spring sign an agreement to construct a gas pipeline into Turkey. Israel, of course, I won't repeat what was said before, but again, I think it's just the Russia's balancing act between Israel and Iran is quite fascinating. I think there are a lot of dangers to that for Russia, but the fact of the matter is it has been able to play this balancing act between Israel and Iran very well, and each side views Russia as an interlocutor. Lastly, the Lebanese officials even have come to see Putin as influential in the region. Lebanon has now accepted $5 million in Russian military aid. For over 10 years, Beirut has turned down Russian military deals, despite multiple very persistent Moscow attempts, primarily because of U.S. military assistance to the country. But Putin's persistence, it seems, has paid off, and certainly Prime Minister Hariri has traveled to Moscow on a regular basis. And like other Lebanese politicians, he continues to talk about Russia as a capable mediator, providing an indirect channel between the Syrian regime and Lebanese adversaries. Russia's influence in the Christian communities, in Lebanon especially, but also throughout the Middle East, is also worth noting. And as other panelists have mentioned, Russian role in Libya is something that's been going on for several years. Russia's built connections with everybody, while the U.S. ostensibly remains pretty much absent. Now, what's next in Syria? I think there's many questions, and Mark also alluded to this in his presentation. Russia cannot deliver development, and that's why it is going around asking everybody else to pay for Syrian reconstruction. But I also think that because Russia sees the world through this very zero-sum realpolitik conflict resolution, but being able to manage conflicts and being able to have this role. And I think it's going to keep doing this going forward. It's going to look for leverage to create dependence on the Kremlin. So we think of great power as somebody who's able to deliver development and conflict resolution. Russia seems to pursue this from a very different perspective, and certainly Middle Eastern actors also covet Russian influence, Russian weaponry on all sides, and therefore it's frankly fairly easy for Russia to wield influence when it's welcomed. Even if not all of Moscow's plans pan themselves out, because Moscow's influence is coveted, it will continue to wield influence, I think, for as long as the United States, how do I put this? I'll conclude with this. Oftentimes, I've heard analysts say or ask, what is Russia's end game in the Middle East? That's been the question asked since Russia brought itself back into Middle East. My answer to that is that we've had little game of our own. And that is the fundamental, I think, reason why Russia has been able to achieve so much influence. And until the United States has more game of its own, I think the story is going to continue. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna. So we now have quite a good time for the discussion, which is what we were hoping to have. So I would welcome questions from the room, and I will ask you to identify yourself, and I also welcome discussion among the panelists. So, yeah, let's begin, Sarah, here first.
Hello, thank you. I'm John Blumer from the World Bank. I just wanted some views of the panel on the, obviously the consensus seems to be that the Russian intervention in the Middle East and Syria has turned out quite successfully, at least to date. But just on the other side of the coin, I was wondering what your views were on the U.S. strategy. I mean, the initial U.S. strategy seemed rather enigmatic, and there seemed to be a bit of war fatigue not to go into Syria. And probably the U.S. assumed that Russia wouldn't succeed because it looked like quite a quagmire. I think that word was used by some politicians, I forget who, quite a quagmire. But it did succeed. But the other question is really, was this also a decision by the U.S. that it was convenient for Russia to go in because the U.S. really did not want to go in there? So was it a strategic mistake or was it a strategic decision? I just was wondering your views on that.
Let's collect 3 questions, so then we can give you the floor.
Thank you. Bill Veal, retired Foreign Service. I have a question for Katerina. Could you elaborate on this term you've used many times, regionalization? What do you mean by that, I mean, from a political science point of view or otherwise a practical point of view within the region? Thank you.
And so there, yes.
I'm Stanley Coburn. There's a saying attributed to Napoleon. You can do everything with a bayonet except sit on it. Lots of bayonets in the Middle East, and they're being sharpened. As some of the panelists have noted, Russia has been able to maintain good relations with all the players, really quite extraordinary. But if this escalates to war, note that the Israelis have been going after the Hezbollah tunnels. They've been attacking inside Syria. The Saudi regime is acting tougher. We're talking about an Arab NATO. Let us say this explodes, it escalates into an open confrontation between Iran, Syria on the one hand, Israel, Saudi Arabia, supported by the United States on the other. What does Russia do? Can Russia then act as a mediator? Will Russia intervene on one side or the other? Can it maintain its status if it simply tries to keep its head down? What does Russia do in that case?
Okay, who wants to begin with one of them?
So I'll start with the first question on U.S. strategy. Unfortunately, look, under President Obama, there was very little appetite to get involved in Syria, and he's made that pretty clear based on the experience in Iraq. So I think that it was fairly easy to take advantage of that for the Kremlin. And then remember the famous 2013 non-enforcement of the Red Line in Syria. That is when Obama said that that use of chemical weapons was going to be his red line. Assad did use chemical weapons, and in the end, Obama did not intervene. Instead, Russia offered to offer this deal, eliminating Assad's chemical weapon arsenals, although the disclosed chemical weapons arsenal, I should say, because chemical attacks continued. But that was a big signal to globally, frankly. I mean, look, I even remember talking to somebody in Japan afterwards, after the U.S. didn't stand by this red line, and they felt, because Japan has its own concerns about China, and they said, well, is the United States going to support us, because we now are not so sure anymore if China tries to do something. I think that that's mainly the reason, and the quagmire comment, it came also from many officials, but also from President Obama at the time. I think, from what I've seen at least, the Syria campaign was very much designed not to be a quagmire. I actually think that they were quite cognizant of not repeating it, and there are many differences between Afghanistan and between Syria. For one thing, Iran did all the heavy lifting for Russia. When Afghanistan, it was thousands of body bags coming home to Russia, thousands of body bags were coming home to Iran. Russia had a pretty limited footprint, and it was fairly cost-free. Now, I add to that the benefit of using Syria as an advertising, very cynical advertising arena for Russian arms sales, for testing and advertising. That also helped boost Russian arms sales. All in all, the cost, and we don't know the full cost to some extent because they remain secret, but certainly it doesn't look like it was a crippling cost by any regard, and it was a very light footprint. What that shows also is today's Russia is not the Soviet Union. Putin has studied the fall of the Soviet Union very well and extracted a lot of lessons for himself, and I think Afghanistan was one of them. And certainly building good relations with Israel was another one.
If you wanted to go in reverse order. Couple points. Echo everything that Anna just said, and I think that has to be emphasized. And one of the things about why Russia has the weight it does in the region, and Putin has the stature, and we can't overestimate that. Mark mentioned it, and others. The fact is that you see the leaders of the region with Putin more than with U.S. presidents, both with President Obama and now with President Trump, culminating in the fraternity handshake between Prince Mohammed bin Salman and Putin in Buenos Aires. That's not accidental. And part of it is because Putin does not overpromise. He does not come in and talk about grand transformations of the Middle East, peace in our day, democracy springing up everywhere. He talks about very limited things that Russia is prepared to do. And as I have heard now for many years from the regional officers who come to the War College, even from countries that don't like Russia and people who don't like Putin, they say he does what he says he's going to do. That gives him a lot of credibility. When red lines aren't enforced, when you make wink-wink promises to people, as we've done in Iraq and then in Syria with the Kurds about self-determination, and now we're not really supporting you, and that people have long memories in the Middle East, and they will say the U.S. promises a lot and is inconsistent with delivery. Russia promises little, but does what it says it's going to do. That's where I think we're at today. The quagmire point, I think, also emphasized this was a classic case of U.S. mirror imaging. We're not going to go into Syria because when we go into Syria, we want to go in and we're going to reconstruct it and we're going to send in 100,000 people and we're going to rebuild the institutions. The Russians said, our job is to make sure that Damascus doesn't fall. And they did that. Whether or not Assad takes every last inch of Syria is not relevant to Russia having succeeded in Syria. They will have succeeded. If Assad disappears tomorrow, he outlasted President Obama. That's a victory for the Russians. Not whether or not Syria is a stable state, not whether it's a democracy, not whether or not it has improved quality of life. The goals were set, they were limited, and they were achieved. Explosion in the region, Stan, that's a great point. I think one of the things that you're seeing again is that the countries of the region that wanted to pursue maximalist agendas, U.S. allies that wanted to pursue maximalist agendas. So Turkey, we want Assad gone. Israel, we want the Iranian nuclear program eliminated. Saudi Arabia, we want Iran's influence eliminated. United States, we love those goals, but now our support is inconsistent. And we like it, but now we don't like it. The Russians have been selling a thing that says, look, we're not gonna establish long-term arrangements. We're here to show you how to do short-term Congress of Vienna jury rigging arrangements that allow major powers not to have to go to war. Because I think one of the things is that the countries of the region don't want that. Israel doesn't want to have a full-fledged war. Saudi Arabia, as much as that wonderful propaganda video about Saudis were going to be greeted as liberators in Tehran, people saw that last year. They don't want to be pushed. They don't want an accidental conflict. And so the Russians come in and say, well, jury rig. Look what we did with deconfliction zones. Look at how we set up little spheres of influence, and we are able to do this. That's where the Russians are gaining their influence. And if it blows up, the Russians will say, well, we tried, but it's not our fault. Versus the U.S., which invests itself that when there's a policy failure in the region, it immediately becomes interpreted as the United States has been defeated. Right? So the narrative of Iraq is not that the United States won the Iraq War. It is America was defeated in Iraq because it didn't achieve its long list of goals for the region. The Russians will say, look, we tried to mediate. If something breaks out, they'll step back. I don't know that it'll have that much of an impact on their view where people say, well, you know, the Russians, you didn't do it. And Mark, maybe to draw you in on the Iran thing, I don't think the Russians, I think, have made it very clear to Tehran, there's no blank check for them. If they tangle with Israel in a way that is unjustified, the Russians will tell them that they're on their own. They may quietly support them, they may sell them weapons. You know, because remember, it's about lessons, out of your point about studying. Putin has not only studied the fall of the Soviet Union, he's also studied how the Soviet Union came to be. And one of the lessons that was told to me was, yeah, look how that blank check to Serbia in 1914 worked out for Russia. A real smart move for Russia, because that was what led to the Soviet, in a way, led to the Soviet Union. So no one in the region gets a blank check no one gets a blank security check. And if Iran wants to do something stupid, and we've seen it already in Syria. Iran does something stupid in Syria or Lebanon, and Israel strikes, and the Russians sit back and say, gee, I guess someone wasn't manning the S-300 battery that afternoon. But it doesn't seem to impact, again, the Russians don't suffer a loss of credibility. So maybe Mark, using that as a way to toss it to you.
Great. Thank you very much for that observation, and I think you're certainly correct that the Russians have made it clear to the Iranians that they don't have a blank check, and yet the Iranians persist, that they keep on doing what they're doing, and it seems to me that they're I mean, what we've seen in Syria is that you know, the Arab opposition has pretty much been defeated. You know, the Russians and the Iranians have together they have triumphed. There's an old saying, you know, in international relations, the purpose of an alliance comes to an end. Often the alliance comes to an end. I'm not saying that the purpose has completely come to an end, but I think we do see that Russia and Iran have different goals in Syria. Because for Russia, it's the protection, preservation of the Assad government, its bases, that they're prepared to live with everybody else. But Syria was always just a means to an end for the Iranians. In other words, it's the bridge to supporting Hezbollah that the Iranian government for you know, it's not the subject of this conference, really does have issues with Israel, really does seem to want to fight them. And it seems that the Israelis feel the same. And the unfortunate thing is that it's not a question of, you know, can Russia tamp things down? Can anyone tamp this down? I think that's part of the problem. And that's where I think, you know, Katerina's point that the regionalization of power in the region means that, you know, external powers like the U.S. and Russia may have limits. But what I also did want to say, you know, we're always, you know, praising Putin's policy for being so much more successful than the Soviet policy, that Putin was doing so much better. But you know, there's one way in which I think the Soviets were more successful, and that is that Putin has tied himself to the status quo in the Middle East. That basically, you know, there's all these actors that don't like each other. Putin has good relations with them all, but they're all essentially the powers that be. Even the opposition movements like Hezbollah or Hamas, Fatah, these are, you know, sort of you know, bureaucracies, or these are long established parties that have, dominated by their leaders, not really grassroots movements so much. The difference was that when the status quo changed during the Cold War, pro-American government fell, the Soviets were there to capitalize on that. The downfall of a pro-American government would lead to the rise of a pro-Soviet. That didn't work in Iran in '79, but it worked in an awful lot of other places. Now, where in the Middle East will the downfall of a Middle Eastern government benefit Russia? I'm not saying it will benefit the U.S. either, but that both the U.S. and the Russians are tied to the status quo. And I think that if there's one prediction we can make about this region of the world, is that the status quo is under challenge, and that sometimes it does not hold. And what's Putin's strategy for that? Will it be to quit getting good with the new people, or will it be to try to prevent this change? But the difference, I think, between the Soviets, just to sort of, I grew up during the Cold War, as many people did here, they really did ally themselves with the forces of change back then. That was an advantage that they had and that they capitalized on. Whereas I don't think that can be said about Russian policy now. I'm not saying it can be said about American policy, but I think part of the American policy toward the Arab Spring was an attempt, like, if these changes are going to happen, then we have to adjust. And that I'm not sure that can happen successfully with the U.S., but I think that there's a real doubt that Russia can adjust to a change in the status quo either.
If I may just jump a bit on before I answer questions that were directly to me, but on the U.S. strategy or lack of strategy, just one short comment on Obama that he didn't want to get engaged actually in Syria. True, but the point is that there was one really irresponsible statement that he made very early on. When it all just started, it was not yet even full-scale civil war yet, when he basically said Assad must go, without backing that up with anything, emboldening a lot of actors on the opposition side. It's not that they all Islamicized, they're all active veto players on the ground, real people to talk to, real actors are Islamists. Others are immigrant, whatever. But at that time, there were still major secular forces within the opposition. Not everyone has radicalized yet, and at that time, saying that, after Libya, when Western countries were actually ready to go the great lengths, I think that that was huge miscalculation. Now, regarding the Trump administration, well, there was a lot of confusion, of course, initially about what they are up to. But I think Russia kind of calmed down a bit when it was clear that basically it's going to boil down more or less, well, it was a year or two ago, to three directions of U.S. policy, more or less traditional to U.S. policy, at least in this century. Obama was a slight departure, but which would be support of the security of Israel. It's nothing new, and then dictating, harsher approach to Iran as a sort of a byproduct, if you like. Then the Gulf countries, and particularly Saudi Arabia as the key partner. And finally, anti-terrorism as well. Back to the war on terror and so on. We're not going to build governments or nations where we're going to fight terrorists and so on and so forth. So that is how it looked, some years ago. Of course, there was clearly no interest in any large-scale stabilization experiments anymore, anywhere. But what it boiled down to was something different, was a mix of, micro-militarism, some erratic demonstrative steps aimed primarily to domestic lobbying groups and allies, perhaps a bit, but again, this was not a problem at all to Russia, as long as it couldn't, alter decisively the course of event in Syria. This annual airstrikes, once in a year, they're U.S. airstrikes. They don't do much. They cannot change anything radically. This becomes a problem. So it cannot stop Pakistan or whatever, but this lack of strategy on Syria becomes a real problem when it comes to Geneva, to the UN solution, because there will be no, there'll be no UN solution without US constructive engagement. I think this is also pretty clear in Syria. So that's why these early signs of, at least some revival of interest in diplomacy as well on Syria are most welcome. Even if, and there's a lot of contacts now, behind the scenes between Russians and Americans. The Israelis leaked just one, the 8th of November in Vienna, Ambassador Jeffrey basically meeting the Russians, but they've been really frequent. I have to, just a couple words on regionalization. Well, I referred to many things already. Some things that I want to stress, maybe apart from reaching out to multiple regional partners, despite tensions with them, occasionally despite tensions between them and despite tensions within them. That's one point. A very important aspect of regionalization of Russia's policy that I forgot to mention is, but it's easier. It's not something you can demand from, like, the US, for instance. And well, it's easier for Russia that have itself undergone a very significant transformation in the past years. It has already lived through all this, aftershocks and convulsive disorder of a former empire. We are over that stage. You are still to face it. We are over that stage. So Russia transformed, everything transformed. Economics, even politics. Borders, an identity, foreign policy, everything. So for Russia, it's easy to play with regional powers as an equal, to treat them as an equal. That's normal. There's no problem, mental problem with that. Not as a boss. Not as a white man's burden, something, but as an equal. That's a very important element. And of course, I think Nicholas or Maria, Anna, sorry, and sorry again, I called you Ivan. Never mind. But one of the, I think you alluded already to the fact that Russia doesn't try to dictate or to influence that much domestic setup. It doesn't come and say, you need this or you need that. It's not even, in fact, Russia is so much more flexible regarding domestic, for instance, for post-conflict transitions in the region, regarding the system to be, much more flexible than it is at home, regarding its own system. In the region, it's not at all. It's a very primitive way to think that Russia just stands for heavy-handed autocrats everywhere. That's what it wants. No, not at all. The major difference, what distinguishes Russia's approach to post-conflict transitions from local strongmen, particularly Republican strongmen, remaining whoever, Assad, Sisi, Haftar. Is that Russia is ready for far more pluralistic representative solutions. It has been talking, for instance, in its talk with the Syrian opposition. They have some healthy ideas. All parties in Syria more or less agree that, you cannot federalize the country too much, the territorial integrity has to be preserved, but basically the opposition has been floating with this idea of unitary, decentralized system. Unitary but decentralized. A lot of powers to local administrations and so on and so forth. Russia has no problem with this idea. It's quite fine with this idea. It does not, it agrees with part of the Syrian opposition that, for instance, so in terms of future constitution of Syria, that it cannot be just cosmetic amendments to the 2012 constitution. It has to be really, if that constitution is a basis, it has to be really significant revamp of the system, and so on. So I think that also plays a role. I have to shut up.
Yeah, let's take a second round of questions. Maybe here, the mic is coming between you.
Hi. Oh, this is not on. How do I turn it on? Yeah, this mic is dead.
Hello. I am a second-year graduate student in the Middle Eastern Studies program. My name is Rebecca. I have a quick question for Nicholas. For your vectors and sectors outline, to me that sort of strikes me as very common throughout the world. That's sort of how governments work. So to what extent is that unique to Russia? What makes that unique for Russia?
Second question here.
We have an interesting precedent in the Middle East where a almost track-to diplomacy effort in Spain, and then the football got kicked up to Scandinavia, wound up as a UN process for the so-called roadmap for peace. And I wonder if we, despite US skepticism about the Astana process, I wonder if perhaps we could view that as a preliminary, maybe even a think tank that can generate a report or a list of suggestions that then get bucked to Geneva. My concern is the complete absence of the U.S. in that Astana process. The conference halls are one block from the U.S. Embassy in Astana, and they're the most awesome conference halls on the planet. Well, it doesn't have to be high-level representation, but couldn't the U.S., send a couple of diplomats up the street, literally up the street, to the conference halls, to at least watch the process, if not make suggestions that could be recycled to Geneva?
And sir here, and then we will have a lady in the back.
My name is Nafa Magrawa. I'm from the Embassy of Algeria. And I have one comment and one question, please. For the comment, when I listen to your valuable interventions, I feel that the role of Russia in the MENA region is dissociated from the domestic U.S. policy. I give you an example. The CATSA Act in 2015, adopted by the Congress, the Republican Congress, against Russia and against its partners who buy arms from Russia, are sanctioned. I think the domestic, the balance of powers here in the United States impacted the role of Russia in the MENA region. The war fatigue, as mentioned before, with the Obama administration, the strategic vacuum in the region, and after that, the balance of powers here in the United States. Thank you very much.
And then we have a question in the back.
Meredith Pontius from American University. I just have a quick question. Russia's red lines domestically are quite different than its red lines in the Middle East, specifically in regards to Russia's primarily newfound embrace of Islam in the Middle East. Do you think that could come to backfire in domestic politics for Russia, specifically in Chechnya?
Katya, would you like to go?
Yeah, sure. Just 1 second. The absence of the U.S. from Astana. U.S. formally is an observer. So it even showed up for a couple, we had 11 meetings so far, so it showed up several times. It kind of, it's erratic, it stopped showing up and then it does, indeed, I don't see why not, you know. If you compare it with consultations, regional peace consultations that Moscow hosts on Afghanistan, for instance, you would see a pretty similar picture when the U.S. is invited, you know, but fails to show up in most cases. The latest round, that can be overcome, you know, because last time we finally had, so there was a lot of fun in the room when people thought that China became too impudent to sit behind the name tag of the United States empty. But it was a guy from the U.S. Embassy, well, American, Korean, but so they came, and then you know, Khaled Zat is just coming back and forth. There are constant consultations and so on and so forth. So I'm not that pessimistic on that, but it's just it's especially when last April, when we for the first time all countries like Afghanistan, all 4 big neighbors, all 5 Central Asian countries, Russia, the first time we had such a magic gathering to discuss peace, you know, in Afghanistan, and then the U.S. ambassador, even an ambassador doesn't show up, no one shows up, and then at the same time you had this mother of all bombs thrown on, you know, donkeys and non-comparable. That was a very conspicuous, you know, statement. Now on the question was domestically. I'd say that shift that I was talking about, Russia's softening on political Islamism in the Middle East, it's a product of a previous, earlier shift at home. Okay, when Russia switched from a strictly military solution in Chechnya, which failed, you know, solution was not war. Even an interim solution that we have, the solution was not war. War failed as a solution. It took pains, a lot of years, a lot of blood for Russia to arrive to something more nuanced and comprehensive, which is a combination of basically seizing upon an internal split within the insurgency, backing up local ethno-confessional, not Islamist, not Salafist, yeah, but ethno-confessional, traditionalist forces, with everything that comes with it, you know, with all the negative elements also that come with it, but backing them up as a more manageable alternative to transnational Salafi jihadists, you know, and pouring money onto them. It was a golden age of oil money, you know, and giving them basically carte blanche. But not just gangsters from the street, you know, the heads of one of the 2 main Sufi orders in the Republic, the Qadiriya. Qadir family, the family has the order, they're sheikhs of the order. Yeah, but basically that shift domestically at home required certain changes abroad and make possible certain shifts abroad. For instance, you needed to engage this emphasis on the moderate Islam as an alternative to Salafi jihadism and so on and so forth. Russia refused to have a legal federal ban on Wahhabism, for instance, although there were demands in the Duma and whatever. Why? Because we need to develop relations with Saudi Arabia, you know, and Hajj, organize the Hajj, and so on and so forth. So, in a way, I think it is a rare moment where actually Russia's domestic development influenced what was going on, Russia's policy towards the Middle East. Generally, there's not much influence. Generally, Russia's Middle Eastern policies, because the region is not the one of vital importance to Russia. And much of what was said, you know, why Russia has a degree of maneuver. You don't forget that this is not. There's not a single region of vital importance to Russia except for its own immediate Eurasian, Eastern European and Eurasian neighborhood. And in that region you would see a very different behavior than from one that I'm describing towards the Middle East. I have to stop.
Okay. Thank you very much. With regard to the question on Chechnya in particular, you know, some years ago, maybe a decade ago, it was Dmitry Trenin wrote a book that basically what he argued that, you know, a lot of Russia's Middle East policy at the time had to do with concern about Chechnya. And what Moscow wanted to make sure was that Chechnya never became a cause célèbre in the Muslim world the way that Afghanistan was in the 1980s, and that you know it had started to become in the 1990s. Certainly, an awful lot of Russian commentary, not just commentators, but officials, laying the Chechen insurgency on Saudi support for Chechen rebels. The Russian image of Saudi Arabia then was very similar to the American image of Iran, where there was nothing good came from these people. And I think that one of the successes that Putin has had is that the status of Muslims in Russia is not an issue for the Middle East or for the broader Muslim world, partly because they just plain don't care. But you know, they didn't have to care about Afghanistan, and yet they did. On the other hand, I'd like to point out, as Marlene wrote for the Jamestown Foundation, I think it was 2 years ago, her piece on, you know, sort of the changes in Russia, that there are demographic changes taking place, and that, you know, people differ, but that by mid-century or later, the total population of Russia might be 30% Muslim, perhaps 50% Muslim, and that being the case, there's good relations with the Muslim world won't prevent problems if those are going to be. In other words, that this is a separate issue that Russia has. Now, maybe it's not going to be an issue, maybe it's going to be fine, maybe the Russians will peaceably hand over power in Russia to their Muslim fellow citizens. I kind of doubt it, but perhaps that will happen. But if not, in other words, that this is a you know, just as there is demographic change taking place in a number of other countries, including our own, that have political significance, this is one that's taking place in Russia, and it's not clear what the strategy is. In other words, and it could involve the Middle East. As I was talking about before, if these forces of change, you know, come into the region, they'll probably be anti-American, anti-Western, but unlike in the good old days of the Cold War, when you had Marxists who were pro-Soviet, probably those who are part of the change now are going to be as anti-Russian as they are anti-Western, and Russia's a lot closer. So, you know, I think that this is you know, it's a possible problem that is developing, is boiling up for the future.
Sure, just a few comments on the Astana process. You know, this was a process that was meant to create an alternative track to Geneva to sort of sideline the United States. And so it's understandable, and U.S. observers indeed come, but there's also a very good reason why they didn't participate in it. It was meant to ostensibly sideline the United States. That said, there were many other groups, frankly, over the course of recent years that have also boycotted these talks as well, publicly, those that are in the Syrian opposition. And ultimately, but the larger point, what's interesting about the Astana talks is that as it was meant to sideline the United States, it was also, as its principles, continue to affirm the international governing documents that talk about the eventual political settlement of Syria, like the UN Security Council Resolution 2254. Now, what's also interesting about this document is that is the roadmap. That is the international roadmap that we have for an eventual solution to Syria, if there is one, if it comes to that. That document reaffirms several things. For example, the 2012 Geneva Communique. The Geneva Communique was also an earlier document that talked about a transitional government for Syria. The spirit of that document envisioned Assad's departure, but the actual language of that document was very vague, purposely so on the Russian insistence about which opposition groups would be included. And that allowed Moscow to engage those opposition groups that did not demand Assad's departure. And it's within the actual text of the document. It is within that law, if you want to call it law. So 2254 reaffirms the Geneva Communique. It also reaffirms Iran's four-point plan on Syria, which on paper, sort of on the surface, looks very similar, but is more about Iran's own ambitions for Syria. There's also other gaps in this document. Again, there's the issue of, who's going to, which opposition groups are going to be excluded. And I think the consensus at the time, I remember the discussion at that point was certainly ISIS and al-Nusra were two organizations that would not take place. But beyond those two organizations, there was a lot of ambiguity. And I guess that's the critical word, is ambiguity. What I see Russia doing, frankly, is using this existing framework, but using the ambiguities to its advantage, and one of which, of course, is making sure that if an election were to take place, that it would be to the advantage of Assad. By the way, that document does not mention Assad at all. There's nothing about Assad's crimes against his own people, nothing about releasing detainees in the Syrian prisons. It's certainly, it's the most precise document we have to date. In the United States signed off on it, but it also has clear gaps. I just wanted to point that out. On Russia's domestic issues with Muslims, it's very important. You often hear analysts talk about a Muslim Russia, and that's because Russia's Muslim population continues to grow while the rest of the population is declining. And so I just wanted to underscore that point. It is very important. With regard to Chechnya, when you look at the early separatist movement, when Chechnya before the first Chechen war, not the second, but the first, that original opposition was actually secular. In fact, its leader he had a famous gaffe where he talked about praying 3 times a day instead of the requisite five daily prayers, and that's because this was a secular opposition that wanted to break away from the Russian state. And over the course of this conflict with Chechnya and Moscow clamping down on Chechnya, what we ended up seeing is a slow Islamization of Chechnya itself. So Ramzan Kadyrov, that Moscow installed, has actually led, he's done such things as talked about, he supported polygamy and honor killings. And so this is not the type of person who is ultimately going to bring a lot of stability to Russia. I would just leave it at that.
Before I get to the specific question, one last thing about the domestic issue that we can't overlook. We often talk about Muslims in Russia and Muslims in Russia as 2 separate categories, and ignores the fact that there are increasing numbers of ethnic Russians who are Muslims. Small, yes, to be sure, but they're there. And so the idea that Muslim means ethnic minority, just as in Russia, Orthodox does not necessarily mean Russian. And for those of you who like to get into the weeds of nationality policy, this issue right now in Tatarstan about whether the Kryashin, the Orthodox Tatars are a separate nationality, that goes to that issue as well. And the thing that I always find interesting about Kadyrov, the work that Shemiev did in Tatarstan and elsewhere, which is to lay the basis for some degree of, hey, even if Islam becomes greater in Russia, we still give a primacy of place to Orthodoxy as kind of a national religion, even if you don't believe in its tenets. And yeah, we're all kind of fellow believers. You go a different way, we go a different way, and that may ameliorate some of this. But I do think it's important to highlight, because that is a holdover, I think, from the Soviet period, where we often use Muslim as code for Central Asian nationalities versus Slavs. Inside the Russian Federation now, Muslims are both members of ethnic minorities, but also a growing number of ethnic Russians. That's going to be the interesting test, when someone who is of clearly Slavic Orthodox stock, who is Muslim or whose parents and grandparents have been Muslim, is asserting, say, a right to run for the presidency in 2040. And where does that go from there? On the vectors and sectors, you're certainly right, every country has this. What is important about the Russian case is we in the West analytically have tended to ignore it. We love the idea of the strongman leader who decides everything. So, for example, the Russian intervention in Syria in 2015, I don't know how many pieces of analysis I saw that said, well, this is Putin because he's nostalgic for the Cold War, and that's the Russians went into Syria because Putin resents losing the Cold War. Yes, the cognitive makeup of a leader plays a role in the country's foreign policy, but there are interests there. And the point is that if the Russian elections had gone in a different direction this past year, and today we were talking about President Ksenia Sobchak, she would still be faced with the same sets of vectors and sectors. She may be inclined to move policy in a different direction. She'd still have these same factors. We have tended in our analytical community in the West not to want to look at them because we like the idea of the autocratic strongman deciding everything is a model we've adopted for Russia. What is different about the Russian vectors and sectors, though, from the U.S., say the U.S. system, is the U.S. is a very overly formalized, overly bureaucratic interagency process, which often is too slow, doesn't react quickly, is reactive. The Russian way, I think, particularly the way that the presidential administration mediates this, is that there is a lot more personalities involved and a lot more willingness to kind of really cut deals, policy deals, in a way that would never survive an interagency review in the U.S. So I do think there are some factors of how the Russians deal with balancing their vectors and sectors that is different, and that merits further study, not just simply for the Middle East, but just for understanding Russian foreign policy as a whole.
Katya, will you one sentence?
First of all, one thing that is really worth mentioning here regarding the question on links between Chechnya and the Middle East was, more recently, as you probably noted, Russia has started even using actively its own Muslims and Muslim leaders in all sorts of behind the scenes or more open, including like mediation initiatives. It's very natural, for the Misrata rebel delegation to come to Moscow via Grozny, or to basically Kadyrov people co-managing Russia's contact group on Libya. Why? Because Kadyrov is Russian version of how to integrate a Misrata rebel. That's Russian way of dealing with Misrata. He himself is like Misrata rebels before. Just our way of living up with them. And then very quickly to Nicholas. Nicholas, the biggest test regarding Muslims in Russia would not be with native Muslims in Russia. The biggest test would be with Muslim migrants.
Yeah.
When we come to the second generation, when they start to have kids who will be born in Russia. This will be, we are France and Europe was a generation ago. Massive migration, a massive migration.
Super quickly, I'm sorry, I know we're coming to our end, but what's fascinating about this is very important about Kadyrov as an envoy in the Middle East. It's a very, very important point. What's fascinating about that is that I would argue, look, perhaps in the short term, Putin was able to pacify Chechnya, but it hasn't provided a real solution. And if Russia continues to apply that model to the Middle East, it's not going to provide a real solution either.
Well, as you can see, discussion could continue longer, but it's already time for us to stop this first panel to have a short break for lunch, which will be served outside, and then we will reconvene in half an hour, and we will be continuing the discussion, moving on more kind of targeted discussion on what is really happening in Syria. Please join me in thanking our wonderful co-panelists.